Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today for our session on decarbonizing Oregon's affordable housing sector. My name is Leah Celestial, and I serve as the Affordable Housing and Equity Manager at the International Living Future Institute. And I'm joined here today by Rita Haberman, representing the Built Environment team at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and Nate Ember, who's a principal architect at Ink Built Architecture. So today we're going to give a bit of context around how and why the affordable housing sector is well situated to lead innovation in addressing not just the housing crisis, but also the climate crisis. So we're going to describe why it's critical to start thinking about both of these crises in conjunction and start addressing them as we develop more housing, and kind of shed a light on why how doing so ultimately benefits the communities that we serve, and actually aligns really well with a lot of the goals of affordable housing developers. So the three of us are going to provide an overview of what that looks like. Our goal here is really to demystify decarbonization and kind of make the case that significantly shrinking the carbon footprint of our affordable housing projects is actually within reach, and it's more attainable than we think. So on behalf of the International Living Future Institute, I'm going to share a little bit about our programs that focus on decarbonization, and also talk about some of the affordable housing project teams that we've worked with through the years to sort of support them as they pursue some of their green building goals. And then I'm going to hand it over to Rita, who's going to talk a little bit about the Oregon DEQ's efforts to support and incentivize decarbonization. She's going to share a few resources around the topic in the state, particularly as it relates to housing. And we're going to close this session by hearing from Nate, who's going to share his expertise as an architect and break down what decarbonization looks like on the project level, and highlight some practical strategies for design and development teams. So Nate's going to share a case study of Timber Ridge, which is a project out in Grande that pursued zero energy. So he's going to describe the design process and some of the different decisions that can be made to significantly decarbonize the building, while also reinforcing a lot of the goals of the developer. Just very quickly before I begin, I just wanted to share a little bit about the International Living Future Institute and the work that we do in the green building industry. So ILFI is an environmental nonprofit working in the building sector, and all the work that we do is fundamentally driven by the question, what does good look like? So in other words, instead of envisioning a world that's simply a less bad version of itself, we really try to center all of our work around this very simple but profound question. This diagram is sort of another way we look at it. So if you look at the impacts of any building project, you can go from green, from code to green to high performance to sustainable. And all of that really focuses on reducing negative environmental impacts. At ILFI, what we really try to do is try to strive to go beyond that and really think seriously about how we can go beyond mitigating negative impacts, and then instead try to cultivate positive impacts around social, cultural, and ecological environmental concerns. And we striving for that more regenerative future is the basis of our mission. So over the years, we've developed a suite of certifications and labels that serve as powerful tools for the building industry to help advance this mission. Our flagship program, which we're most known for, is called the Living Building Challenge, and it's widely considered to be one of the more holistic or aspirational green building certifications in the industry. And that vision for net positive outcomes that I was just describing is really fully realized in the Living Building Challenge. In addition to the Living Building Challenge, we also have programs and labels that focus on things like material health and transparency for building products, organizational equity, and then of course, our zero energy and zero carbon programs focus on decarbonization. And that's what I'm going to talk about the most today. So within ILFI, we also have our affordable housing program. And what that is, and this is a program that I help manage. What the affordable housing program is essentially, it's a supportive peer engagement network of affordable housing project teams that receive additional resources, technical assistance, mentorship, and opportunities for a lot of peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge and expertise for project teams that are engaging with different green building, regenerative design goals. The premise behind this program is really the belief that everybody deserves to live in regenerative, resilient, healthy buildings, and that when we talk about things like climate, health, and equity, we really need to include the communities that have historically been excluded from this conversation. We recognize that at this point in time, there are some very specific challenges that come with affordable housing projects, especially as they engage with green building and regenerative design concepts. And so at ILFI, we really try to understand what these challenges are and offer some added resources, develop some resources for our affordable housing projects. Our goal here is really to move the needle, to move the whole sector further a little bit with each pilot project that we support. And 10 years into our affordable housing program, we now have about 64 affordable housing projects across 28 states that are pursuing and engaging with our programs and certifications. Just moving on to the actual presentation. So earlier, I had mentioned two intersecting crises that are seemingly in contention with each other. So we have the climate crisis and we have the housing crisis. This slide illustrates that apparent tension between the two. So we, the built environment's contribution to the climate crisis is pretty well documented. We're currently on track to exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming threshold in the next 2 decades. And according to Architecture 2030, buildings and construction account for almost half of the world's carbon emissions. So we know this, and we also know that we urgently need to build more. In fact, if we're going to meet the world's affordable housing needs by 2030, we would need to build 96,000 new homes per day. So we know that we urgently need to build more. We also know that doing so will have some pretty significant climate implications. And so holding both of these ideas in mind, we simply just cannot build in the same way that we've been doing. And so when we talk about things like decarbonizing housing, it really just, in plainest terms, it really just means rethinking how we design housing, how we build and how we operate this housing to try to manage its contribution to climate change. That said, addressing the climate crisis isn't the only compelling reason to do this. Like I mentioned, several of the benefits that come with decarbonizing our projects actually align really well with a lot of our goals around improving the quality of life of the communities that we serve. So for one, we know there's a very disproportionate energy burden on lower income households. A study by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy found that low income households actually spend over twice as much on energy as a proportion of income compared to the average US household. We also know that low income households spend more on energy on a per square foot basis. And on the developer operator side, energy costs are typically the highest controllable operating expense in affordable multifamily housing. And so if we invest in building more efficient housing, running on renewable energy, that a lot of that vulnerability to fluctuating energy costs and rising energy costs is largely eliminated here. In addition, eliminating the need for fossil fuel combustion in housing also has a lot of benefits around indoor air quality, occupant comfort, resident health, and things like that. And then Finally, leveraging the built environment to accelerate climate action is also a step towards addressing a lot of the inequities that come with climate change. It's pretty widely documented that low-income communities and communities of color um, are just significantly more vulnerable to climate disruption and a lot of the effects of climate change. And so decarbonized housing that's more resilient, more climate adapted, if we focus our efforts on that, we can begin to mitigate some of that disproportionate vulnerability to climate disruption as well. So now we've talked about the why, and the real question is, what does decarbonizing our housing actually look like? So to understand this, we first need to understand what makes up the carbon footprint of every affordable housing project. And this carbon footprint is essentially made up of two things. So we have first operational carbon, and we have embodied carbon. Operational carbon is essentially the energy that we consume as we occupy and operate our buildings. So it's everything we need to keep the lights on. It's heating and cooling. It's everything needed to keep it running. And these emissions are produced at the power plants where we either purchase our electricity or in the buildings themselves if they have a natural gas connection, for example. I do want to stress that the overwhelming majority of decarbonization efforts in the built environment so far have focused on operational carbon. So when we talk about things like energy efficiency, when we talk about things like installing renewables, it's really just those operational carbon emissions that we're trying to offset here. In contrast, embodied carbon, the emissions from embodied carbon occur mostly before a building's even constructed. So these emissions are associated with producing all of the building materials that we use, but not just that, it's all the emissions from raw material extraction. It's the emissions from transporting these raw materials to the manufacturing location. It's transporting the finished product to the construction site. It's all the emissions from energy consumed during construction. And then at the end of the building's lifespan, it also includes emissions from maintenance, demolition, and disposal. So this is a really excellent graphic by the Carbon Leadership Forum that illustrates this contrast between embodied carbon and operational carbon. So as you can see here, operational carbon is shown in blue under the use phase of the building, and everything else falls under embodied carbon. Now, operational carbon is a very significant part of a building's footprint, but as I mentioned, the building industry has made some really incredible advances as it relates to things like energy efficiency and renewables. And as our buildings get more and more efficient over time, we're gonna start to see a shift where embodied carbon really becomes more and more critical. And so we really need to start thinking about this holistically and start taking into account the whole life carbon of our buildings. So how do we do it? Up until this point, I've talked about what decarbonization is and why we need to do it, but really the essence of this session is how do we get there? So Rita, Nate, and I are going to present different frameworks for this, and I'm going to begin with a couple of frameworks for how to engage with decarbonization offered by the International Living Future Institute. And so we have zero energy and zero carbon certification that we manage, and both of these can sort of be seen as a bit of a North Star in the green building industry for creating a decarbonized building. So first, our zero energy certification focuses entirely on just the operational side of things, so just operational carbon. The requirements for zero energy are very simple and straightforward. First, 100% of a building's annual energy needs just need to be generated on site. And second, you can't burn fossil fuels. That's it. What sets the standard apart is it measures actual energy performance, not just modeled performance. So all of our projects undergo a 12-month performance period where they would really need to demonstrate meeting these requirements essentially through their energy bills. And this adds like an added accountability measure there with focusing on actual performance. And what this certification reflects is really just the simple concept of a project operating within the carrying capacity of its site, utilizing just the energy resources that are available locally. In contrast, zero carbon certification looks at both operational and embodied carbon. So we're looking at the whole building's carbon footprint here. It does have requirements around energy efficiency and renewables on the operational side of things, but it also has some very specific requirements around reducing that embodied carbon in building materials. So projects pursuing zero carbon certification will need to undergo what's called a life cycle assessment for the whole building and to actually account for these emissions. And we have more and more tools available on the market for us to be able to do that, a lot of which are actually open source. I believe zero carbon is the only performance-based carbon standard that looks at both operational energy and embodied carbon. And when a project is certified to zero carbon, they can actually say that they're either carbon neutral or even carbon positive in some cases. Now, I know I mentioned that these certifications are sort of like a North Star here, but and the value of pursuing certification is really just having that third-party verified performance-based sort of accountability measure that demonstrates your commitment to meaningful decarbonization. But what I want to stress is, having said all of that, it's not all or nothing. There are several different starting points and pathways that we can all take right now to begin to decarbonize our buildings. And the standards I mentioned are just some helpful frameworks and starting points to understand the things you need to look at to begin to decarbonize. So I'm going to share a few strategies for how you can begin to engage with these decarbonization concepts by making certain design decisions. So this slide is pretty high level and it does focus on embodied carbon. And the reason is, as I mentioned, we already have a lot of awareness around some of the operational carbon strategies like energy efficiency and renewable energy. So as you can see here, the strategies that have the highest impact for reducing embodied carbon are shown on top, and this impact kind of decreases as you go down. So first, we have materials reduction. So I believe it was Carl Elephant who said the most sustainable building is the one that's already built. And so if the more we reuse our buildings and reuse our materials, the more we eliminate emissions from having to produce new ones. Beyond material reuse, we also have some very effective strategies like prefabrication and advanced framing design to really improve that material efficiency. And it's going to touch on that a lot more with his case study. After options for material reduction have been exhausted, we then look for material alternatives. And what that looks like could be replacing concrete with steel and steel with something like mass timber, which has a lower embodied carbon and also sequesters timber throughout its life cycle. I'm gonna skip over these few slides for the sake of time, but just wanted to share some of the zero energy certified programs that we've worked with. We have some in Washington, Austin. We have some single family homes in Moab, Utah that achieve zero energy. We have a really helpful financial case study up on our website for a project in Washington that's higher density affordable housing that pursued some of these goals. And we also have a couple of projects in our current affordable housing cohort that are actively pursuing zero carbon. And finally, just wanted to plug, we're hosting our virtual affordable housing summit next month. So please check it out and we'd love for you to join us there. And now I'm going to hand it over to Rita. Thanks so much for listening and being here today.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, everyone. My name is Rita Haberman. I'm with the Built Environment Program at DEQ. And I'm going to provide a little bit more additional context on embodied carbon and why it's important and how it's playing out in our state. And I'm also going to share some kind of exciting new programs that we have underway and resources that you might find of interest. And oops, I'm bad at this already. Yeah. And so first off, you might be wondering, why is DEQ working in the built environment? DEQ tends to be most known for vehicle emissions testing and chasing down polluters and maybe promoting recycling. Well, about 15 years ago, DEQ undertook a strategic planning initiative. And it was the waste and recycling program at that time. And the staff took a life cycle perspective on materials, meaning trying to really understand what are the impacts of materials. By taking a life cycle perspective, what we realized is the lion's share of the impact of the materials that we use are upstream. If all we're doing is focusing on disposal, we are missing the biggest opportunity. Also, by taking a life cycle perspective, it helped us realize the significance of the impact of the built environment, with which Leah shared some of that context. So today, built environment is one of the formal programs within DEQ, and we aren't just in the waste and recycling world. We are really focused on materials management, all materials that we use, including building materials. Whoops. Digging just a smidge deeper with regards to embodied carbon. I think this is still a relatively new concept for some folks. And as Leah shared, embodied carbon of a material is really the grand total of all of the impacts associated over the course of the life cycle of that product, from extraction, manufacture, transportation, and so on. An example of this is, let's think about concrete. When we think about the embodied carbon of concrete, we might think rocks, sand, water. All those are locally sourced, not much processing. That seems like that doesn't sound so bad. We also need to think about the cement, the binder for those concrete mixes. And it takes a lot of energy to produce cement. Extreme heating, and then there's also chemical processes that produce a lot of CO2. So when we also consider that cement, concrete in total has a huge carbon footprint, and it's one of the products that we use most extensively in building. When we take a life cycle perspective and think about not just cement, but all the materials that we use, again, the vast lion's share of those impacts are upstream in the manufacturing and to some extent the construction. So that's why we are focused heading upstream to reduce those impacts. When we think about the life cycle of a building, and we think about at what points and stages in the life of a building, what are those carbon impacts? What are those operational carbon impacts and the embodied carbon impacts? As Leah noted, right up front, we have a huge embodied carbon impact. Before we cut the ribbon for the grand opening, before anyone moves in, there is a huge embodied carbon impact. We as an industry, as Leah noted, we've made tremendous strides in reducing the operational carbon, and a lot of that is due in part to codes getting more and more stringent. Over the last 50 years, a code built building generally has been, the energy load, operational energy load has been knocked in by one half. It's really significant. When we pay attention, we can make some significant differences. Given our climate crisis, excuse me, and our understanding of materials, it's time for us to put more attention on the embodied carbon of our materials. So how do we measure embodied carbon? Well, we could geek out really, really fast here, but think of it as a super rigorous accounting methodology that looks at all the inputs, all the outputs, and the impacts. And this is a very standardized methodology that's based on a number of ISO standards. The output or the reporting that comes out of a life cycle assessment, and believe me, you don't want to read the 150-page report, but you might want to take a look at the 5-page environmental product declaration. You'll often hear the term, just the code, EPDs. You'll hear EPDs all the time. Think of EPD as, it's kind of analogous to a nutritional label for food. So if we have EPDs for our building products, we can compare the global warming potential of those products, or embodied carbon. Global warming potential and embodied carbon often are used interchangeably. So if we have labels for products, we can compare the embodied carbon of comparable products similarly to how we can compare the caloric impact of food that we're considering. So EPDs are an important part of the puzzle here in demystifying what we're using and how to make better choices. When we think specifically about the state of Oregon and the impact of building materials, Oregon DEQ just updated the state's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And what we found, you can see on the screen, more than 14% of our consumption-based emissions are associated with the construction materials that we use. More than 1/8 of our impact is coming from our construction materials. That's a pretty significant chunk of the pie. One definitely worth looking at more closely. So what are we doing about it? And how can we reduce the embodied carbon impact of the materials that we're using? Well, one thing is to make environmental product declarations for the products that we use more readily available. This summer, Oregon DEQ, in partnership with the state of Washington and folks from the International Code Council, we were successful at securing a $3.5 million grant from US EPA to support manufacturers of building products serving Oregon and Washington so that they can produce EPDs so we can better understand, so they and we can better understand the impact of their materials. So we anticipate we'll be working with more than 200 manufacturers over the next 3 years, and anticipate that that'll result in at least 1,000 additional EPDs, again, to help inform our choices. Another thing we're doing at DEQ, we're doing our best to chase down as much federal money as we can. And also this summer, we were successful at securing $200 million from EPA. This was a joint effort with Oregon DEQ, Oregon Department of Energy, and the governor's office. And we put together a joint application to pursue 12 different very strategic climate action strategies, one of which on the right-hand side relates specifically to reducing the embodied carbon of housing. More specifically, so we secured 25 million of that 200 million, and that is going to go towards 2 specific housing strategies. One is to provide incentives to encourage the reuse of existing buildings that are currently underutilized and convert those to housing. As Leah said, the most sustainable building is one that's already built. We've got a lot of underutilized buildings. Let's start using them. And we're not just talking about high rises in Portland. There's a lot of second-story buildings throughout main streets across small town Oregon, across the state, that we could be converting to housing. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is to encourage and incentivize the production of additional space-efficient housing, smaller housing, adequate housing, but space efficiently well-designed housing. Both of these strategies inherently are low carbon strategies because we're using less materials. And then space efficient housing offers that added benefit, as Leah mentioned. The smaller structures are going to take less energy to operate, heat, cool, ventilate. And another really interesting thing is if we have smaller spaces, people tend to buy less junk and fill up those spaces. And that's another piece of our climate puzzle, but that's a whole different topic. The way we've structured this grant is the folks who are best qualified to get money out the door are local governments, not Oregon DEQ. So we're partnering with 9 local governments that you can see up on the screen there. And each of those local governments will be administering their own competitive grant processes to distribute those incentives. When it's all said and done, we're anticipating that that $25 million will help support the production of an additional 900 housing units. Helps. We got a long way to go, but it's a piece of the puzzle. And we also see great upside in terms of us being able to educate and inform a lot of project teams about what is embodied carbon, share resources, and do some interesting analyses and really understand the carbon impact and what else we could be doing going forward. Another piece of the grant is that we're requiring that funded projects demonstrate at least a 10% embodied carbon reduction in the materials that they use to build out those housing units. And our approach for this is we're basically going to follow the 80-20 rule, meaning there's a small handful of product categories that account for the lion's share of the embodied carbon impact. So let's focus on those and let's not worry about the nails. Let's not worry about, some of the, doorknobs, whatever. Let's focus on those big, high impact, high volume materials. And those materials are, surprise, surprise, concrete is the biggest, insulation, exterior cladding, sheetrock, and flooring. So Oregon DEQ is in the process now, and we're probably going to hire an outside contractor to help us with this, to put together a technical support package to support all these funded projects as well as everybody else. So that's in the works. Oops. I'd like to call out just a couple of resources that you might find helpful if you're excited and interested to dive into embodied carbon. Your first stop should be the Carbon Leadership Forum. They are just providing top-notch, best-in-class research, resources, references, and trainings, and they're all free. So they are absolutely just an incredible resource. I'd also like to note Architecture 2030. They've put together some really helpful and compelling and interesting resources to help us all better understand embodied carbon and where are those impacts, where do they take place, and what are they associated with the building materials that we use on a regular basis. And as I noted, DEQ is in the process of putting together technical resources, which should be available by the middle of next year, maybe a little bit sooner. Oregon DEQ is in good company as it pertains to embodied carbon initiatives and policies. The state of Oregon, state of Washington, state of California all have a number of embodied carbon initiatives that are at the state level as well as the local level. I do want to just call out one of these items in particular, the fourth one, Oregon Building Codes is currently in the process of exploring the possibility of including embodied carbon within building codes, as well as taking maybe a non-code perspective. They're considering both. They owe a report and recommendations to the Oregon State Legislature by the end of this year. We think well, we're really excited to see it. We've been collaborating with them, but it's their report, so they own it. We're nudging them, but we're excited to see what they produce and their recommendations, because we think that's going to set the stage for a lot of our work, our collective work, the big we, to come. And just one, in closing, I'd just like to reiterate that embodied carbon is a big piece of our climate action puzzle. There's a lot of resources currently available that can be applied, carbon neutral. Some are even offering, cost neutral. Some even offer cost savings. And I think those are just going to continue to grow as we all become more familiar and build our practice of addressing embodied carbon. Super important issue of our time. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to pass it to Nate.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Leah. That was some awesome groundwork, and there's so many exciting pieces that you're all working on. And it's our job as architects, helping affordable housing developers understand all this complexity and pull it all together and try to utilize all these resources. And it's just great that we're all kind of collaborating in trying to make that happen. It's a lot. So we're Inkbuilt Architecture, women-owned firm. I'm the one dude in the partnership. But yeah, so we are focused on affordable housing, shelter, and kind of bringing an equity, sustainability, and affordability lens to all the work we do. So yeah, so as we take this to the next step, what does decarbonization look like on the project level, and how does it align with with or reinforce other project goals? So as Leah was talking about operational carbon, I'll go through kind of, which was kind of the main focus of what our case study project, Timber Ridge, focused on. I'll kind of go through that. I'm going to touch on a lot of different things in here that I won't have time, that they could all be deep dives, but hopefully during the question period, if you all have more you want to dig into on any of this, please do. So in this case, the client really wanted to know, can we reduce the energy cost or eliminate the energy cost for residents? Because that's, as Rita said, that's yet another big chunk that folks have to deal with, and it's just harder and harder to do. So we said, sure, we can do that. Obviously, the owner isn't going to want to pay those utilities either, so let's go net zero and figure out how to make it so nobody has to pay for it. And so the steps that we found, and a lot of this, we've been kind of developing strategies project to project as we try to move all of our projects towards net zero. And really, everything's kind of inverted from what it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. So now your cheapest and most, yes, please. I'm terrible at clicking, apparently. So step one. Thank you. Thank you, Rita. So, the lowest cost, highest impact is to maximize solar first. And especially because this is a project that had a lot of roof area, because it's 2 to 3 stories. We just said, okay, let's orient all of our roofs and everything and just maximize that, because there's solar energy tax credits. The folks we partnered with on this at Fleet Development did a fantastic job of helping the project take advantage of those. This project, a lot of projects in Oregon are in ETO territory, who has a lot of incentives and things, which is great. This project was not, so we didn't have direct utility incentives, so we had to get extra creative, leveraging, and it was a kind of independent co-op utility, so they didn't have some of the grants that you can get through PGE or Pacific Power. So we kind of had to leverage a lot of things, and that's what it takes, is finding all of the different avenues that you can try to leverage. And then, yeah, you want to keep your systems as efficient as possible. In this case, we also had really complex limitations to stay within like 25 kilowatts per meter panel, and it was just a whole lot to juggle. And then planning for like energy monitoring, EVs, all the different things that kind of come into that. But and so we definitely utilized every bit of roof area on this project, except we didn't need to use the carports, which were a required thing. We thought we might have even more solar there, but it's a little more expensive. Step 2, as Leah spoke to, you want to have zero combustion when you're trying to reduce carbon and eliminate emissions. So we had no natural gas infrastructure and planned for everything to use heat pumps. So, you know, and the idea is to move heat around, not make it, right? Because if you burn something, you emit carbon, and it's a one instance of a moment, and a lot of impact long term. So try to avoid that. Here's kind of just an overview image of the site with all the buildings and solar. So, and then step 3, like I was alluding to, you want to utilize heat pumps as much as possible, because what those do is use a little bit of electricity to move heat that already exists in the atmosphere to where you need it, whether it's into your hot water, into drying your clothes, into heating your space, or cooling your space. So that's what those do. And it's a very cost-effective and kind of multi-benefit strategy. So because you also want to kind of couple that with good ventilation with heat recovery. So that improves indoor air quality, it improves occupant comfort. And of course, as we're housing more and more vulnerable populations, you know, climate is changing. It's really important. And it's also really important to make sure there's resilience built into your systems, so that if you have a power outage or, you know, extreme conditions, that you are keeping people as kind of safe and reasonably comfortable as you can. So in our case, we utilized heat pump, ducted mini split heat pumps that were in the ceiling in each unit. And those were coupled with the ERVs. And we also had heat pump clothes dryers, which save a lot of energy from kind of standard vented dryers. We had heat pump water heaters. Most of them were the kind of individual type, so one in each unit. And I can talk later, maybe if there's time, about that, because we also got a grant from BPA to look at a centralized system in one of the buildings. So this project was interesting because the scale of the buildings was not quite ideal for centralized hot water, but we still wanted to kind of study a different kind of heat pump in a centralized application compared to the individual ones. So we're looking forward to more data around that. And then, yeah, these heat pumps also have outdoor units, these little compressors that you've probably seen if you have air conditioning at your house. Or so these little guys involve a lot of coordination, a lot of yeah, they take up space. They kind of get in the way, especially on a tight site like this where we're trying to kind of do it cost effectively. We studied lots of different ways to mount these things and ended up back with kind of a pretty basic mounted on the ground situation. But you can see that there's lots of little hoses and lines and things to consider. So, and this climate, or this project was in a snowy climate, so there's stuff around snow and ice that have to be considered. On the hot water side, there's you know, the maintenance concerns of just making sure you're controlling temperature and freezing conditions. We had a lot of kind of go arounds on both types of water heating, and so there's just a lot of considerations to take into account when using these systems. But there's more and more support, more and more research going into them. They're getting more common, so there's a lot of good resources there. And then step 4 is, of course, then to make the building enclosure as efficient as possible. This turns out to be one of the more expensive upfront costs, but long-term might actually be the most cost-effective and resilient way to go. So there's always going to be a balance between your first cost and your long-term maintenance costs, because all those systems I just talked about have, you know, long-term maintenance costs, replacement costs that that are significant. And so the more you can also make sure that the building doesn't leak energy, doesn't lose energy, right? Then you're just taking a lot of that out of the equation. You're making a more durable and resilient building all around. So in our case, the most cost-effective things were around limiting air leakage. So that turned out to be a challenge for sure. We used kind of, especially because this project was in a rural area, there's not a lot of kind of subcontractors who are used to high performance building. And so the kind of conventional methods of air sealing were tough to accomplish, but thankfully there's like a technology called AeroBarrier that we use, which kind of sprays sealant into the air, and then it finds all the little cracks and crevices, and that was super effective. You want to maximize roof attic insulation. That's really cheap to do, and it has a really big impact. There's now really good ultra low E glass. You don't have to use triple pane anymore, which was always a big cost driver, because it also drove like kind of a more expensive window unit in general. And then we used conditioned crawl spaces at the floor line. I'll talk about that more later, and advanced framing to reduce the amount of thermal bridging in the wall, which also has benefits of reducing the amount of material you're using. And then all of these kind of details take a lot of coordination to make sure that it's happening, that things are being well sealed, the insulation's going in really effectively. Oftentimes it's not. In this case, the mock-ups and kind of initial stuff we went over with the contractor looked really great. And then over time, you sometimes get to see different results. So it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of kind of constantly communicating and making sure that that follow through is happening. And some of the kind of key details we found for air leakage were things like the pre-hung entry doors, attic hatches. We had a detail that really tried to seal up those openings, even just little sprinkler heads through the ceiling, all the little ducts and how they move through. We actually had a lot more air leakage even within the envelope of the dwelling units than we thought. So there's just a lot of little, air finds its way. So there's a lot to do there. And then the other part that Leah was talking to is embodied carbon. And although this project didn't have kind of a specific motivator around reducing embodied carbon, it had goals around using local materials, keeping, maximizing material efficiency, reduce the amount of waste, and all of those goals about local economy, help to kind of lead towards lower impact materials. And so we definitely used some of that thinking to try to get to a better result. And so we reduced concrete wherever possible, kind of used it very minimally for foundations only. Reduce the wood framing, as I was saying, through advanced framing, and then reduce the amount of finishes that you have to apply wherever you can, because those are just extra materials, right, that have to get replaced. And obviously flooring is a big one that is never an easy answer in affordable housing, because you need that durability. You also need to be able to update and replace it, but it has a lot of embodied energy. And so that's a big struggle for the industry that everybody's working on now, which is awesome. And then just utilize natural materials where you can to offset site paving, like asphalt and concrete, though it's really hard to get rid of some of that in just the day and age we live in. And then there's kind of the struggle too of the more you strive to reduce, like design to have a really efficient use of materials, we don't always get to capture those cost savings. And there's kind of industry reasons for that, but a lot of it is just subcontractors kind of charge by the square foot in general, and they don't really look that closely and sharpen the pencil. And it's just kind of a tough situation that we have, and that's kind of another deep dive we could go into, but don't have time right now. So an example of kind of reducing concrete here is you just see just the minimal foundation walls, and then everything that could be wood framed was, including, even though these have to be an accessible ground floor where you got to have that floor aligned with the floor outside for accessibility reasons. that makes it tough to do a crawl space typically, but we used insulated conditioned crawl spaces to kind of achieve that and not have to vent the crawl spaces, which also improves energy efficiency. And instead of having a concrete slab on grade, now you have a wood floor to reduce that embodied energy. We did have goals for advanced framing, though in a few cases we had what we love to call wood sandwiches, which I don't recommend. So the only ways we've really found to get around that is to kind of get in the weeds and do framing plans that really illustrate to folks who aren't used to efficient framing exactly how to do it. So that takes a little more effort than usual, but this is an example here where early in the project, they weren't actually following the advanced framing. So that's the image on the bottom left. And then you can kind of start to tell on the right-hand images that there's a little bit less wood there in the walls specifically. And that helps both thermally and just reducing the amount of materials you have. We also tried to, lay the site out to be as efficient as possible. So concrete and asphalt only where you have to have it for parking and getting in and out, and trying to eliminate it everywhere else. And yeah, then on the interior finishes, really just kind of trying to keep things as minimalist as possible. We utilized actually ILFI resources and health product declarations and EPDs to select the flooring to try to find kind of the best option we could. So those things are always super useful to us when designing. And like in the community building, that we use the slab on grade as the finished material. It's super durable and robust, and looks really nice for that kind of community space. And then we, kind of the ceiling and the roof trusses were all just kind of left exposed, just trying to kind of utilize as much of that as possible. And the whole project really is kind of wood framed, right? So the more we can just use wood, it can be as regional as possible, is always the goal. So yeah, so then choosing those low emission materials, which I already kind of spoke to a bit. We did strive to use low carbon concrete, but that proved to be really difficult in the rural market. We kind of leveraged some of the resources out there, but between, just kind of budget constraints and time constraints, it just didn't happen. It's a tough one to implement, but there's a lot of potentials there to reduce carbon in the concrete you're using. You can use, like Rita referred to insulation being a big one. Cellulose insulation is just recycled paper and saves so much embodied energy. So doing that wherever you can, and it's not very costly. So those things are great. And just, also thinking about durability and kind of timelessness in finishes too, so they don't have to be replaced every 20 years or when things look dated. But if they can just last, you're definitely kind of getting ahead. So, and then there's different things on the construction side that are harder to control in terms of how do you get materials and people to and from the site, especially in a rural area. There's about how there's a lot of energy that goes into drying out buildings when you're building them in the wintertime, just, pumping hot air into these things. So all of these things are opportunities to kind of at least to have conversations and try to figure out, is there a way to specify something, working hand in hand with your general contractor to figure out what we can specify for the subcontractors who are bidding the project, who probably have no idea about any of this stuff. How do you get them, just to start thinking about a couple simple things that each of them could do? And so there's a lot of potential there that we only got to kind of scratch the surface of. And minimizing concrete and steel, as was mentioned earlier. So building everything out of wood that you can. We did that with stairs, just having concrete for that finished walk surface where it really has to last. Even just the trash enclosures, building those things out of wood and keeping them as kind of minimalist as possible. And really, people deserve to feel their connection with nature. So utilizing wood as wherever you can has so many benefits, psychological, aesthetic, as well as all these kind of ecological benefits. So just try to celebrate that really here in the Northwest. So these are just some examples of how we tried to do that with siting and kind of, yeah, really make the aesthetics of the building tie into these ideas. And then the last step there is considering the kind of site location and long-term impacts of what it's going to be like for especially folks living there, right? In this rural area, people are going to be driving a lot. And so is there anything that can be done to, you know, incentivize people to use like shared EVs, or hopefully more and more people will use electric bikes because it makes it so easy to get around, even if you got to go a ways, you know. So just trying to figure out how much of that infrastructure can you provide for and really offset that ongoing carbon impact of living in a particular place. And so then there's just a kind of a few images of the project under construction, just to kind of give you a feel for it. And the gorgeous setting that we had in the mountains out there. And yeah, so that's basically the overview of Timber Ridge and kind of our approach. And we're definitely open to any questions y'all might have.
Thank you. I'm going to step right in the middle of it here. Your timber, are you talking mass timber here?
This is all kind of conventional wood framing and timber, if you will. There is some like heavy timber, so these like larger columns and beams you're seeing, but it's not mass timber in terms of that kind of the trendy thing of mass timber, which yeah, and so that's a really good thing to kind of point out is mass timber is a fantastic replacement for concrete, especially which is necessary for like really large buildings, high rises and such. That's where it's really shines as a material. It's actually not necessary, and it has more wood than is needed in smaller residential construction. So anything like 5 stories and below basically can all still be kind of conventional light wood framing, and you'll use less material and yeah, less embodied carbon. So it's a good distinction.
Was spent just on fighting wildfires this year. And if you stop and think about all the lumber that just burned up, and then plus the carbon that was used on heavy equipment, on people fighting those fires, I think that if we put our focus back to using timber, it's going to be a positive, especially
Absolutely.
Are you directing that question to me? Well, for the, I shared with you a couple grants that we secured from EPA. The one for supporting manufacturers to develop EPDs. We do not yet have that contract signed with EPA, but we expect that in the next in the coming months, before the end of the year for sure. And we anticipate that that program will be active for 3 years, or until we run out of funds, meaning we will have supported all the manufacturers that we proposed to support. So basically a 3-year time frame, ramping up now. And then for the incentives for building reuse and space efficient, that's also pretty fresh. We have not yet signed the contract with EPA, but again, that one is supposed to be inked, middle of October, and we'll be ramping that up as quickly as we can. The nitty gritty of how that will play out will be probably more in the hands of the local governments than Oregon DEQ, depending on their grant cycles and their capacity. And the lifespan, if you will, of that grant is 5 years. And of course, all of us who are involved with construction, we know, yeah, 5 years, that sounds like a long time. Well, it evaporates real fast, right? When you're talking about a construction project, especially when you think about the full cycle from, visioning, concept, design, and construction. But I think that's all the more reason and kind of re-emphasizes the importance and the potential benefit of the building reuse, right? Because we can do those a heck of a lot faster generally than from the ground up new construction. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, the 25 million from EPA for building reuse and space efficient, that'll all trickle down, if you will, don't like that term, to support and we're providing incentives. You all know this better than I do. So many affordable housing projects in general. We're cobbling together a lot of funding. So we're throwing a little bit of ice cream on top of the cake, hoping to help get some of these projects up and over the hurdle to reality. Yes, in the back. You want to take that one? Yeah, I'll support you.
It is a great question. I'm not. If you have any thoughts, go for it.
So, the strategy of using EPDs, honestly, that's I don't know, it's kind of analog. Well, it's important, but it's kind of analog. It's definitely informative, but there are much more sophisticated tools to help inform our design and construction processes. And you're familiar with energy efficiency. Whole building energy modeling can be a tremendously helpful tool to inform the design from an operational carbon perspective. There's also modeling that can be done to model the embodied carbon, whole building life cycle assessment. Those are kind of analogous tools. And I don't have a hard and fast good answer for you, except it's complicated. There's a lot of trade-offs, and I think the more we, as an industry, are really looking at the full life cycle impacts. Nate called out, flooring's really tough, right? We're trying to, use healthy, durable materials. We're also trying to, reduce the carbon of those materials. It's complicated. I wish I had a better answer for you, but there are some, more sophisticated tools. Leah, help me out.
Oh, just to add to what Rita said. So we can't address what we don't know. And if we start with she mentioned, we have a suite of tools that are available to us to do a full energy model of our building on the operational side. If we also have a growing library of tools to do full building life cycle assessments. And a lot of those are actually just plugins that you can add to your Revit model, for example. And it's really just starting with that and identifying your climate hotspots along the whole life cycle is your first step, and sort of identifying what are the different levers you can pull and how does that affect the full carbon snapshot of your building. And sort of like, it's really just understanding where your hotspots lie initially. And then on top of that, it's also Rita in her presentation earlier mentioned there are some big ticket items here for embodied carbon. So start with the concrete, start with the steel. Those are like things that are very much known at this point. And then kind of go a step further by kind of translating that to your specific project and where that comes out with the quantities that you have and how you've designed it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would emphasize there is basically that 80% rule is kind of what we followed, right? Is like, you know, because you can spend a lot of time deep diving and trying to track it all down. But if you know those top 5 items and you just focus on those and how do we how do we reduce them or offset them or pick the best option, that's definitely going to have a huge impact. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think in our experience, you know, doing a lot of different kinds of housing build projects and buildings, yeah, there's a few times where you feel a little bit kind of hemmed in by what's possible, you know, within a budget and the goal of like the size of building you're trying to create or something like that, especially when it comes to structural concrete. That can be a challenge, but now there's so many resources around, like say mass timber as an offset for some of those things that only concrete could do before, and the cost is also finally coming kind of at least equivalent in many cases, if not better. That yeah, there are ways to make that work a lot of times now to really kind of get rid of large amounts of concrete. You know, we're doing a lot around modular construction right now in our firm, and kind of offsite, you know, building these whole units, and those can be done in the region, and it can save a whole lot of transportation trips, and the manufacturers know how to maximize efficiency a lot better. So I think there's a lot of potential there. But yeah, it's really just kind of, you need a team that's looking at it creatively and trying to figure out how do we get rid of those high impact materials and use something different. And then yeah, on some of those things like the flooring finishes and whatnot, we just really have to look for the best product option we can find most of the time.
What are some like alternatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was about solar, especially in more cloudy Portland, and even in Seattle or whatever. Like solar is still the highest impact and worthwhile. You'll still get a lot from it. Obviously, not as much production as you would in a sunny climate, but it's still very much worth it. So yeah, you still would even in our Portland projects, you want to start with maximizing solar as much as you can, and still utilize a lot of these. We utilize these kind of same strategies a lot on this side of the mountains. We kind of thought a few of them might shift when we went over to the east side, where it's kind of colder and hotter and drier. And actually, after running energy models, it wasn't that different really. So you can still utilize most of these same strategies, starting with solar. Does that help? Yeah, in terms of trying to like produce a lot of energy, which you really need to do to offset, your energy use in a building, because no matter how much you try to drive energy use down, even things like the plug loads of people using stuff every day, right? It's still fairly significant. So yeah, you got some ideas.
Just one additional thought, for residential projects, hot water demand can be pretty significant. So depending on the nature of your project, it could be worthwhile to consider and explore and analyze solar thermal, to heat water. Sometimes that pencils, sometimes it doesn't, but, given again, the hot water, significant hot water load, that can sometimes pencil out. Any other comments, questions? All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time and attention. Thank you. Bye.